Patch 14.3 is out, and there are a couple of changes that were made to the meta from 14.2. I put together this massive 46-page Google document with 25 different compositions, and I decided to record a video that gives you a guide on how to play every single one of these compositions. I am GM Blue, rank 184 on NA. Not quite rank 1, but hopefully good enough to teach you a thing or two. Hope you enjoy. In S tier, we still have Pentakill, Viego, Akali, Karthus. Now, according to the stats, if you go and look at meta TFT, in last patch, it averaged 4.18, and in the current patch, it's averaging a 4.13 despite having a lower pick rate. So that would suggest that the comp is quite a bit worse than it was before. However, in my experience, I've still enjoyed playing it. I still default to it most of the time. This is still your standard board where you play 3 Superfan with Lilia, Nico, and Gnar, and then you fill out the composition with Mordekaiser, Viego, Kayle, Karthus for your Pentakill units, and then Akali will provide you KDA plus Executioner for your Karthus. Now, the one thing of note here is that by far the best headliner you can get is Pentakill, either Viego or Karthus. I would say that Viego is better because you really, most of the time, don't want Archangel on your Karthus. Also, sometimes Karthus struggles to carry in stage 4 in my experience, so if you find an Akali, you're still going to take her. Her Superfan item Hodge is one of the best ones in the game. When it comes to your items, you're super flexible on all 3 of your carries, so you can run pretty much any spare items that you have for Akali, any spare items you have for Viego. I will say Akali is probably one of the most flexible carries in the game, so if you want to run Runons on her, even though that's not the best item you can, it's perfectly fine. You just sort of make whatever you can on her. When it comes to Karthus, you're just looking for attack speed and mana items, and then for Viego, you want 1 healing item, and then you can go whatever else for the rest of his items. You can go Hodge, you can go IE, you can go Sterix, you can go BT, you can go Edge of Night, lots of different flexible options. In fact, one of the reasons why I still rate this as an S tier comp, even though the stats say that it's worse than it was before, is just because of the fact that you can build any item you want in the early game to streak, and you will find a use for it in this comp. So if you slam an early Sterix, there's maybe not a whole lot of comps that can use that. Maybe you could argue Zed can, but this comp, in my opinion, you can use a mixture of both AP and AD items, melee items, AD carry items. It doesn't really matter what you do, and you'll be able to find a carry for it. So that's the main reason I still have this in S tier. Now, when it comes to your support items, there's really only 2 that have good stats, and that's Aegis and Obsidian Cleaver. Obsidian Cleaver can go either on Viego or Akali. According to the stats, it's better on Akali, which makes a lot of sense since she spreads the effect to pretty much every single unit on the board. And of course, you can take Zeeks, you can take Chalice. There's a number of different things you can take, but according to the stats, these are the best ones. When it comes to Ornn items, practically every single Ornn item in the game is good. It used to be that Mana Zane was not very good, but that was before the Karthus rework. Now, with the Karthus rework, Mana Zane is excellent on him. You can still run Zhonya's on Karthus, although it's a lot worse, in my opinion, than Mana Zane. And of course, every single one of these items is viable. The only one that I would really say is not that great are these 2 down here, Mogul's Mail and Goldmancer's Staff, but that's just because these are subpar items in general. Even if you get them on 2-1, unless you have a really good carry for them, most of the time they're not going to do a whole lot. So ideally, you will reforge these if you get them in the early game. Now, when we talk about augments here, Omnivamp just tends to perform very well, so you're going to see a lot of Omnivamp augments. You have Vampirism 1 and 2 is very good. You have Last Stand that's good, although I will note Last Stand is practically good in every single comp. Then you have Harm Assist 1, 2, and 3. I will note Harm Assist 2 is by far the weakest, and I would only take it on 4-2. Most of the time, but Harm Assist 3 is very strong in this comp, and then Harm Assist 1 is also a very strong silver augment. New Recruit is good. This is just generally a rule of thumb with Superfan compositions, is that getting extra slots is very useful because you're having to use multiple slots on the Superfan units and getting lots of different traits. So if we go and pull this up real quick, you can see how many different traits are active here. If you get that +1, you can add your Yorick later, you can add your Vex completely for free on level 8, and it helps you get to this 7 Pentakill a little bit easier. Maybe you can add an Olaf to this board if you don't get Pentakill Headliner, or if you don't get a Pentakill +1. That actually is one thing I forgot to mention here, is that Pentakill emblem, very strong on Akali if you're able to get it, or on Kayn in the late game. So you can actually replace this Akali in the late game if you're able to find a Kayn 2 and have good items for him. You can actually play him over Akali. Other augments here, Little Buddies. Of course, this is just good with any Superfan composition. You're running Lilia, you're running Gnar, you're running Kayle, so you have have a minimum of 3 little buddies pretty much all the time, and that's going to buff up your Karthus, your Akali, and your Viego, and again, maybe Kayn if you play him later. And then Metalheads, of course, is quite good because you're playing vertical Pentakill. So very good on your Viego in particular, but still quite good on your Karthus, means that he won't get Crowd Diver stunned, and generally speaking, the heal can be useful if you're playing against enemy Akali players. So just a very good useful augment in general. There are, of course, a lot of different augments that are good for this comp. Item augments are very good as well, but there's a lot of those, so I didn't want to show every single one of them. These are just specific augments that maybe aren't good in every comp, but are very good in this one. All right, let's talk about this abomination of a board called Heartsteel Flex. What you're looking at is a million different ways in which you can play the board. Of course, this is quite confusing on first glance, and I understand that, so I'm going to do my best to clarify some things here. First of all, in the bottom left here, in the bottom row, we are looking at all of the different melee carries that you can play with the comp. So you have Zed, Yorick, Kayn, Viego, and Akali, and I've ranked them in relative strength. So you have Zed being the strongest, then Yorick, then Kayn, then Viego, and then Akali. Above that, in the second row here from the bottom, we have range carries. So you have Ezreal, Lucian, and Caitlyn, and that's mostly it. The way that the board is put together is you want to have Heartsteel while playing one range carry and one melee carry. There are different variations out there, so sometimes you'll see 2 melee carries, sometimes you'll see 2 range carries, sometimes you'll see 2 range carry plus a melee carry, sometimes you'll see 2 melee carries plus a range carry. There are so many different variations here for what you can play in Stage 4, which is part of what makes this comp so hard to play, because if you're using your team planner, you're going to miss out on a lot of these different options. So the reason why so many challenger players are playing this comp to great success, but maybe some of the lower elo players are struggling with it, is because they're open to a lot of different lines in Stage 4. I want to emphasize that the difficult part of this comp is when you're rolling down on 4-2, what are you trying to play around? So with each one of these melee carries, you can pair them with different units. For example, Zed gets paired with Yone, which then also gets paired with Set and Zac, and you have 4 units that are kind of filling up half of your comp, right? So you have 2 EDM, you have 2 Crowd Diver, you have 2 Bruiser, and this is going to be a part of the default board. Ideally, your range carry that you play with Zed is Ezreal, which then gets paired with a Misfortune in most cases. It can also be a Jhin or a Kai'Sa if you're not able to find the Misfortune, and then that is going to fill out your 3 Heartsteel. So you have 2 Heartsteel here with Set and Yone. This is your 3rd Heartsteel. You get Big Shot. That's 6 of your units. And then usually you want to fill out the rest of your front line. So in the default version of the comp, you're going to see something like this, where you have Zed, Ezreal as your 2 main carries. You have a range carry plus a melee carry. You have 4 units in the front line here, and then you play Jazz. Now, you're not always going to be able to fit Jazz on level 8. In fact, most of the time, you're not going to be able to fit Jazz on level 8. So let's go through some different variations here. I have a couple of different examples pulled up. So this is a Caitlyn variation. This is if you are able to find Caitlyn during your roll down and you have decent items for Caitlyn. So for example, if you have blue buff plus red buff and you don't have an IE, then Caitlyn is not a very acceptable carry. But if you have red buff plus IE, then Caitlyn is an acceptable carry. And for that reason, I prioritize red buff plus IE a lot higher than blue buff in the early game because it allows you to be more flexible towards this Caitlyn line later on. So this follows the same guiding principles here, where you have your melee carry with Zed, and then you have a range carry with Caitlyn, and you're trying to fill out the rest of the board, so you have Heartsteel. So here you're going to play Cassante because that pairs with Garen, which gives you 2 8-bit, and then you're going to play your Set, Zac, and Zed combination that we saw before, and then you're going to fill this out with Lucian here for a rapid fire unit, if you're able to find Lucian. If you have to play Aphelios instead and have 4 Heartsteel, it's not the end of the world, but of course Lucian is a better unit. Here's another example. This is where if you're able to find Yorick on your roll down, but maybe not Zed, you can, when you find Yorick, then Thresh becomes relevant. If you don't have Yorick, then Thresh is not relevant, right? So this is another melee carry. It's one of the better melee carries you can run. Yorick 1 is actually quite strong, so you can throw your Zed items onto this Yorick, and if maybe you find Zed 2 later on during your roll down, you could theoretically sell this Yorick, or you can just run it for the rest of the game. Okay, so this is yet another variation of what you can play. Here's another variation here. This is where if you're able to find Caitlyn plus Akali, of course, remember, we're always trying to play the units on the left side here and not the units on the right side. So Akali is definitely on the weaker side when it comes to your melee carries, but if you're rolling in Stage 4, you're not always able to choose what your options are. So if you have Caitlyn plus Akali, then you can run this 4 Sentinel frontline, which I've seen before. This is where you have Blitzcrank, you have Echo that pairs pairs with your Akali, you have Garen that pairs with your Caitlyn, and then you want to fill out the rest of the Heartsteel. So you have Aphelios here that gives you rapid fire. You have Set, doesn't really provide anything to be honest with you, but you want to have 3 Heartsteel at minimum. And then you have your Cassante here. You could also consider just running a better unit here and just dropping Heartsteel for stage 4 if this is your roll down, because it's pretty unlucky. But this is another variation that I've seen. Again, every single variation I'm showing here has been practiced or played at some point by a 1000+ LP player, because that's where I found them all. Another variation. So this is if you're able to find Alawi during your roll down. Here you have 2 range carries. You have Ezreal plus Caitlyn. You're also playing Akali here. Again, remember, usually you would prefer to play Zed here if you were able to find a Zed, or if you find a Yorick, you can replace this with a Thresh. But in this case, the player was only able to find Akali, so they filled out the board with Echo plus Garen, and they get all these nice little synergies in the left here, and they have their melee carry plus their range carry. And this works best if you have big shot Ezreal, right? Because you really don't have space for Misfortune in this lineup here, unless you wanted to drop out of Heartsteel, which again, most of the time you don't want to. Now, there are a million different variations here. In fact, this is part of why I think Heartsteel is the most difficult comp to play, and I have not had a lot of success when I played it myself, if I'm being honest. Even after studying it, it's really overwhelming. Again, there's so many different options for how you can play it. I guess real quickly, I'll just talk about how I set this up here. So this is your melee carries ranked from strongest to weakest. This is your range carries ranked from strongest to weakest. This is just a synergy bot. You don't usually play Ziggs unless you have Jazz. In fact, you never play Ziggs unless you have Jazz. Here's your Jazz units up here. Here's a bunch of Sentinel units that work with Cassante. Most of the time, you're not playing the Sentinels unless you're playing Caitlyn, because then you want to play Garen. Here we have units that pair with Set. So you have Poppy, Zac, and Alawi. And then Thresh only gets played most of the time if you have Yorick. Aphelios almost only gets played if you have Lucian or Caitlyn. And then Yone gets played with either Kayn, Viego, or Zed. So that's the basic overall idea here. I guess the one thing I didn't show here was a Viego board. So if you're playing Viego, ideally you have Kayn or Yone. These are edgelords. And then you would add a Kayle to your board, and then either Yorick or Mordekaiser to get 3 Pentakill. You don't even have to play 3 Pentakill. Again, the main goal is to get through stage 4 so that hopefully eventually you can get to the Ezreal Zed board once other people start dying. Okay, so now we're going to move into your support items. So the main thing I wanted to show is that every single support item is viable, with the exception of Needlessly Big Gem. The fights are over way too quickly. This doesn't do anything in the late game. So this is by far the weakest support item. And the best support item pretty much for every single comp is Aegis of the Legion. Okay, but Needlessly Big Gem is definitely the worst one. Don't pick it if you have the choice. When it comes to artifacts, every single artifact is good, with the exception of Gambler's Blade and Goldmancer's Staff. And I will say Gambler's Blade actually works on Caitlyn. You can play it on Caitlyn, but it's obviously not ideal. This item really doesn't do much in the late game. You can also play it on Lucian, so it's acceptable. It's just not great. And then Goldmancer's Staff, there's nobody to put it on. Reforge it if you have the opportunity to, if maybe you get it from a cash out or whatever. And then augments here. So there are a lot of different acceptable augments, but what I wanted to show are the ones that are the best, the ones that are unique to this comp. So first of all, binary airdrop is good in every single comp, but if you get binary in this comp in particular, it's completely broken because you keep getting all these Heartsteel cash outs that give you items. So you're up 1 million items, and then binary makes you up even more items since it's more of a multiplicative augment. So binary airdrop plus Heartsteel, you're pretty much guaranteed first place if you play it well. Combat Caster, I have this in here because surprisingly, very strong stats on 4-2. Just in general, combat augments are very good on 4-2, but in particular, I was surprised to see that Combat Caster was so strong in this comp. I guess it makes sense with Ezreal. If you have blue buff on him, he casts very frequently. So really good stats with Combat Caster. New Recruit, always going to be good in compositions that are playing Jazz. Helps you fit in more traits, helps you fit in more important units. So very strong here. Helps you get to that 3 Jazz mark as soon as possible. What doesn't kill you? This is just for early game. If you're able to lose streak with Heartsteel, very strong. Best Friends 1 is very strong. Best Friends 2 is not very strong, but I couldn't filter it out. Metabolic Accelerator, also very strong if you're able to play Heartsteel from very early on and raise the stakes. And then Pandora's Items 3. I was surprised to see that this is actually quite good on 2-1 only. So not on 3-2, not on 4-2, but if you're able to get a Radiant item and perfect items for every unit on your board for Zed and Ezreal, it's quite good. And that's it for the Heartsteel line. All right, next up we have Twin Terror Lulu. Really, the main idea behind this is you're looking to play the Superfan board that you would normally play with Seraphine Reroll, but there are 3 main conditions under which you play this. First of all, if you get Twin Terror on 2-1 or 3-2. Number 2, if you get Hologram on 2-1, 3-2, or 4-2, ideally before 4-2. so that you know to commit to the comp and get the right items in time. And then lastly, if you get Trickster's Glass from an Ornn Artifact Anvil, either from a portal or from your 2/1 augment. I think the main strength of this comp is if you're able to play 2 Lulus, because the Hyper Pop buff allows you to have both Lulus feeding mana to each other and casting way more frequently. If you don't have the second Lulu, I honestly don't think that Lulu 3 is nearly as strong and really should only get played if you're playing Seraphine 3 as well. Now, when it comes to secondary carries here, you can play Seraphine 3 if you're able to find a bunch of them, or if you find Lulu 3 early enough, or maybe find an Ahri 2 early enough, you'll end up with Ahri as your secondary carry. In fact, most games I have ended up with Ahri as my secondary carry, and it's been perfectly fine. There are conditions in which you will play a Sona on your board. For example, you can see here that with Spellweaver Lulu, you'll actually have 4 KDA if you play Seraphine. So ideally you would play Sona in this spot, and then you would put the Sona between the 2 Lulus and allow them to feed mana to the Sona. She'll cast way more frequently. I think it's actually quite a strong board if you're able to meet, again, one of those 3 conditions. Now, when it comes to support items here, I have noted 4 support items that are not very good. So these are the items you don't want. Every single other support item is completely fine. Chalice of Power being very strong, of course. Aegis being strong like it is in every single comp. The main issue with these, number one, they're either underpowered like ZZ Rot, or they force you into positionings that you don't really like Banshee's Veil and Randuin's don't work very well with a lot of KDA formations. And then the problem with Virtue of the Martyr, I believe, is that you're playing double Gunblade in this comp, so you don't really need the healing from Virtue of the Martyr, and you'd rather get combat power out of your support item or some sort of interference with their team with like Zephyr or Shroud. Now, when it comes to Artifact, there are a couple of options here that are really strong. Mana Zane, Trickster's Glass, and Diamond Hands. Diamond Hands you would throw onto Echo or Nico. Trickster's Glass you would throw onto your Lulu. It does work with Twin Terror, so if you do get Twin Terror as your augment, you can actually just run Trickster's Glass on your unit, and you don't actually have to run 2 Lulus on your board. And then Mana Zane Lulu is completely broken. Also, it's quite strong on Seraphine 3 if you're able to find her as well. And every other Ornn artifact is mostly fine with the exception of Goldmancer's Staff, just because it's super weak. And then, what was the other one? Oh, Gold Collector. Of course, there's no AD carries in this comp, so you don't want to play that either. And then when it comes to your different augment choices here, of course, Hologram, by far the strongest augment. You can even see here in Meta TFT that they list Lulu next to Hologram. That's because it's completely broken. If you have Lulu 3 with Hologram, you're pretty much guaranteed top 2. It's very good in my experience. In fact, I've pretty much, if I look at my average, I think I've averaged like a 2nd place when I play Lulu with Hologram, and I've gone first plenty of times. In fact, my only 100 HP the entire game of this entire set was with Hologram Lulu. You also have Twin Terror, you have Combat Caster, remember your roots, 3's a crowd, you're playing Echo, you're playing Nico, and you're playing Lulu, so pretty good with this comp. Misconnections is mostly if you are looking for Kennen or Lilia on 4-2 or 3-2. This will help you fill that out. Or if you're just looking to get an upgrade for either one of those units, plus the gold is actually somewhat helpful when you're playing a 3-cost reroll comp. Jewel Lotus, always very good with the Spellweaver-based comps, and just generally speaking, very good on 4-2. And then Latin Forge. We just talked about a couple of different artifacts that are quite strong. So in this particular comp, Latin Forge is quite good. And then Return on Investment. Now, the thing I'll note about Return on Investment, I think it's only good on 3-2. In theory, it's good on 4-2, but the issue is that when you're playing 3-cost reroll, you usually want to roll somewhat deep on 4-1 in order to hit your 3-cost headliner of choice. So if you don't have a lot of gold, you shouldn't take this on 4-2. If you do have the gold, though, it's quite a good augment. And then the last one I want to note here is Curse Crown. Of course, this is very risky. Most of the time, you don't want to take Curse Crown, but if you are really close to Lulu 3, or if you do have Lulu 3, you can consider taking it on 4-2 only. I would never take it on any other stage other than 4-2, but on 4-2, if you're able to hit Lulu 3 and you have Curse Crown, and you could play all these additional units on your board, additional Lulus, additional Ahris, additional 5 costs that you're able to find, it's very, very strong. So I just want to mention it here as a niche option. If you're very close to Lulu 3, it is something you can do to win out. All right, so the other Twin Terror comp of the set is with Executioners. They did nerf 4 Executioner and 6 Executioner, so this comp is noticeably weaker. It's no longer a snap take on 2-1 or 3-2 if you're offered the option of playing it. Now, you're only really going to want to play it if you have a good spot for it. It's still the same comp overall, where you play Amumu, Pantheon, Vex, Twitch, and Samira. Find Executioner Headliner, so you have 4 Executioner. I know it's a little bit confusing here because I'm showing 3 of these units. It's really just to show you all the different items that you can slam on these units. There's a lot of different options that are viable here, so I've kind of just gone through all the different choices you have. And then ideally, the way you end up playing this is you actually end up hitting Samira 3 with Vex 3 and Amumu 3, but that's not always possible, so I'm also showing all the different variations if you play Twitch instead. But a lot of times I've found that if you want to try to play for second or third, and usually not even first in the current patch, then you really need this Samira 3 to get there. So here's your best in slot for Samira, here's a bunch of different options for Vex, and here's a bunch of different options for Twitch. I believe this is best in slot Twitch right here, i.e. Red Buff and GS. But again, there's a lot of different options. When it comes to your different support items, there are 3 main support items that are best. You have Aegis, Zeke's, and Chalice of Power. Aegis in particular, because you're lining up all of your executioners typically behind your Amumu, is quite good. And then Zeke's and Chalice also very good because again, usually you end up lining up all of your executioners in the back row. So you put up one of your crappy executioners, just goes in the middle, holds on to that Chalice or Zeke's, you surround it with your better executioners, and you get it on all 5 of the units in the back line. This is one of the few times that with Zeke's or Chalice, you get completely full value out of that item, hence why I think they're very good in this particular comp. Then we go into artifacts. There are plenty of artifacts that are good. In fact, I would say this is one of the most flexible comps for playing every single artifact in the game because you have an AP carry and you have an AD carry. So, and you also play a super tank. So you can play practically anything you want to. I've shown a couple that have particularly good stats. Diamond Hands on Amumu, Infinity Force on anyone, Gold Collector on Samira or Twitch, and then Anima Visage on Amumu. But again, every single Ornn artifact is quite good for this comp. Now we go into augments here. So a lot of different options here. The main thing I want to note is that item augments are very strong here. So I have Buried Treasures, Idealism, Big Grab Bag, the Prismatic item augments, when Unleashed Arcana, Overwhelming Force. Everything that is an item augment you should consider taking here because the goal here is just to be able to itemize as many of your executioners as possible. And if you just purely rely on your natural item drops, that's not going to happen. You're not going to be able to fully itemize every single one of your executioners plus a Mumu. So these are very helpful on that front. You also have Exposed Weakness. Again, this is still an auto take if you're offered it while playing the comp. And then Heavy Hitters, because you're playing a reroll comp. One thing I want to note, Heavy Hitters, it's pretty much good in every single reroll comp, especially if you have AD units. So this is an auto take, especially if you're close to hitting 3 stars. All right, executioners. So this is a little bit different from Twin Terror. This is where you play 6 executioners. So you have your Samira, Vex, Karthus, Twitch, and Akali, and then you pair them with the 2 Guardian frontline with Amumu plus Pantheon. And eventually you're probably going to get rid of this Pantheon and replace him with the Thresh, since obviously Punk for your Twitch really is not that relevant. And you're re-rolling for Amumu 3, Vex 3, and Samira 3 ideally. Although in some cases, if you don't think that's possible, you can also consider playing around your 4 cost with Akali and Karthus. I do want to note that True Damage Akali is better than KDA Akali because this is a front-to-back comp. This is part of why I don't really like playing around Karthus here because this is a backline access unit, and if this is a front-to-back comp, really doesn't synergize all that well. So most of the time, Karthus is just going to be a trait bot. You really want to itemize Samira, Vex, and then eventually True Damage Akali, but not KDA Akali, because again, you're trying to go front to back. This got nerfed pretty heavily at 6 Executioner, so the percent critical chance went from 200% down to 160%. Pretty noticeable difference here. The average placement for 6 Executioners went from like 3.7 up to 4.05, so pretty noticeable change there, but still very good if you're able to hit exactly this board with 3-star Samira, 3-star Vex, and 3-star Amumu, just not as stable as it was before you were able to hit all 3 of those things, which means you're going to die probably a lot more games before you're able to get to that point. All right, let's talk about Punk. So Punk in the stats looks really good. It actually looks like it's one of the best comps in the game. In practice, it's not, for a couple of reasons, but the big one is that it just doesn't cap that high in the late game. They also nerfed the cap of Punk, where they decided to make 6 Punk a lot weaker, or not a lot weaker, but it's noticeably weaker than it was before. So this comp is a tempo comp. In other words, you really shouldn't play it unless you have a lot of Jinxes or a lot of Eyes early on, and if you have some decent items for those units. So in particular, you need to have as many bows as possible for Jinx. You can see here that her best in slot build requires 3 bows. You have Last Whisper, Rageblade, and GS. Now, Rageblade is not very good in the late game, but it is very strong in the early game. So the reason why Rageblade looks so good on Jinx, I believe at least, is that if you look at it from the perspective of what this comp is trying to do, you're trying to win in stage 2. 3, and 4. That's it. At that point, when you get into stage 5 and beyond, you're probably going to lose every single fight for the rest of the game, even if you hit all of your 3 stars. Even if you have a Mumu 3, Pantheon 3, Vex 3, Jinx 3, Twitch 3, Vi 3, you're probably going to start losing in stage 5 no matter what you do, if you're in high enough elo that people are playing meta boards. So when you play Rageblade, it's really just so that you can win in stage 2 and 3. I don't know if I would slam Rageblade in stage 4. In stage 4, you can just slam your Runons or whatever other item instead, and it's perfectly fine. So those are my 2 cents on Punk. This is the standard board that you can play with it. If you get Punk instead, so let's say you don't get Rapid Fire, you can add a Caitlyn to your board. If you get a Punk spat, you would put that Punk spat onto Caitlyn and call it a day. All right, that's the main concept behind the comp. Now, when it comes to your different support items, there's 4 that are above everything else. You have Aegis. Again, that's going to be a commonality between every single comp, where Aegis is just the best support item in the game. Zeke's very strong, of course, for your Jinx. Locket, very strong for your frontline. And then Chalice, surprisingly very good stats, but relatively low sample size. Probably pretty decent for your backline. Then we go into Ornn artifacts. Most artifacts are good in this comp, but I wanted to highlight a couple that are broken in particular. Gold Collector has the best stats on Jinx that I was completely surprised by, actually. I thought Gambler's Blade would be better on Jinx, but according to the stats, Gold Collector is by far the best. Gambler's Blade, of course, very good on Jinx as well. Diamond Hands, very good on Pantheon or a Mumu. And then Trickster's Glass, you can put on any number of units. I think it's at its best on Vi, since she has a stun, but you can also put it onto your Jinx 3 if you want to, and it will do decent. All right, so most Ornn artifacts are good, but these are the ones that stand above everything else. And then when it comes to your augments here, the main thing, in fact, there's one that I completely forgot about. Let me go ahead and add that in there, and that's extended play. So really what you're looking for is you're looking for item augments. In fact, this is the same as what we saw with the Twin Terror comp. You're going to see this for a lot of reroll compositions, is that the thing you struggle with the most is itemizing all of your different carries. So item augments become a lot more useful in these reroll compositions. So extended play is a Punk specific augment that gives you components when you 3-star your Punk champions. Pretty good. Also gives you some gold along the way. Lucky Streak, again, very good, because Lucky Streak on Jinx on 2-1, really, not on 3-2. You should not take this on 3-2. Quite strong. And then all of these other different item augments here are quite good as well. Pandora's worth noting here because you need so many bows to make this comp work. And one of the things that really works against the comp is I mentioned that you're trying to tempo in stage 2, 3, and 4, right? Well, that means you're not going to get first pick on most carousels. And what do you know? Bow is one of the most contested items or components in the game. So how are you supposed to get good items for Jinx? Well, one of the ways that you can get good items on Jinx is Pandora's items. So it's quite good on 2-1 if you know you're going to play Punk. All right, next up we have Yone Reroll. There's nothing that's changed about this comp at all. It's the exact same as it was before. I guess theoretically Mordekaiser's damage got nerfed, but it really doesn't matter in the context of this particular comp. Also, Headliner Kayle got nerfed. Again, not really that relevant here. The main thing here is that because Heartsteel is part of the meta right now, it's the best comp in the game currently, you're not going to hit Yone 3 all that often. So you need a very good spot to take this line, which mostly is going to revolve around like Idealism on 2-1, and you already have 2 Yones early or something, or you have an early Yone 3, or maybe you have Heroic Grab Bag or something that makes it very likely that you're going to hit Yone 3, because the biggest issue for this comp is being able to hit. Now, the fundamental idea here is the same as it's always been for all of the different edgelord rerolls. You're always looking to hold the Pentakill package here. So you have Viego, Mordekaiser, and Kayle, and then here you're going to fill out with Yone plus Zed. Zed is going to be your secondary carry. And then there's a couple of different ways to fill out the rest of the board. You can go with your crowd divers here. That's your ideal method. If you can get to 6 crowd diver, that's the best case. So if we were to show this with crowd diver Yone, you would have Evelynn, Katarina, and Qiyana, and that would be your level 8 board. You can also fill out with some of these edgelords here. So you have Kayn and Riven, and then you can also add a Sentinel to your board with Echo or Blitzcrank. Echo in particular is kind of useful here because it works with Qiyana. And you're always going to play 4 crowd diver here. So you always want to have Qiyana plus either Katarina, or if you have crowd diver Yone, you can just go Qiyana plus Yone and play 4 crowd diver until you're able to find these units, because sometimes you can't find them. But the main cap for the comp is hitting 6 crowd diver with Yone 3. And if you have all combat augments, you can actually win the entire lobby. Otherwise, most of the time, you're probably not going to win out. When it comes to your support items, there are 3 main options I wanted to show here. First of all, Banshee's Veil is by far the best one. Getting CC immunity on Yone is quite strong because you're pretty pretty much never going to build QSS on Yone. He just needs 3 items that actually do something. So if you have Banshee's Veil, very strong to get that CC immunity onto him. Obsidian Cleaver is quite good on Viego because he actually will spread the effect to multiple units. And then I just wanted to show a needlessly big gem because it is the only support item that completely sucks. Never take it if you have the option because it will do absolutely nothing for you. If you know you're playing Yone from early on and you have the option of taking Needlessly Big Gem on 2-1, this is probably one of the times that I wouldn't take it because it's really actually just that bad. And the reason it's that bad is because this is a burst comp, right? Like these melee fights end very quickly. So your gem is going to proc when the fight's pretty much already over. So there's no point. You get no value out of it. Then we have our Ornn artifacts here, Infinity Force and Death's Defiance. This is going to be the case for every single melee reroll comp. These are the main items that you're going to put on them. That's Defiance Yone, quite strong. Infinity Force Yone can be a substitute for Titans. So those are your main options when it comes to Ornn artifacts. Other than that, nothing all that good. And then when it comes to your different augments here, the main idea is you're looking for Omnivamp augments. So that's your Vampirism, your Harm Assist, your Last Stand. Some item augments here. Idealism mainly because you want to have Hodge on Yasuo or on Yone anyway. And then Gifts from the Fallen, very good. Unified Resistance, Long Distance Pals. Anything that makes your Yone stronger is what you're looking for here. Indomitable Will also providing CC immunity to Yone. But the main thing here when it comes to your augments is you're looking for augments that basically give your Yone additional items that are not there. You just want as much combat power as possible. In fact, that's just a rule of thumb for all melee compositions, that if you're playing a 3-cost melee reroll, you want your melee carry to be immortal. That's the goal. You want it to go infinite. And how do you make it go infinite? You build the best items you possibly can on them. You get as many support items that support them. So that's things like Banshee's Veil. And then you get combat augments like Vampirism, Last Stand, Harm Assist, Gifts from the Fallen that make them as strong as possible that they'll never die. Okay. So if you ever noticed that in some games your Yone is completely unkillable, in other games he's killable, it probably has to do with your augments. So augment selection here, very important. All right, let's talk about Riven. So Riven follows the same philosophy of all Edgelord rerolls where you have Viego, Mordekaiser, and Kayle. That's your 3 Pentakill, 2 out of 3 Edgelord package. And then your third Edgelord is always going to be whatever Edgelord that you're rerolling. In this case, it's Riven. And then you fill out the rest of the board with 8-bit units. So that's your Garen, your Caitlyn. And most of the time, you're going to try to avoid playing Corki on your board, but Corki as well if you need him. And then you can fill out the rest with either Edgelords. So that's your Yasuo, Yone, Kayn. You can fill it out with rapid fire units. So, I mean, really, you don't want Jinx or any of these 2 costs in here, but if you're able to find Lucian, it's quite good. And then you can also play Kiana in some cases and pair that with Yone, get your 2 Crowd Diver, and that can also be a way to fill out the rest of the board. So the main thing that got changed here is they buffed Caitlyn, where her max mana went from 90 to 75. So if you have Shojin on her, 1 less auto, most of the time, I mean, really, you just want to build full damage on this unit, but it is worth noting that that buff to Caitlyn has made Riven a little bit stronger here, and she is just generally speaking probably the best 3-cost reroll that exists currently. And when it comes to your support items here, Banshees is completely broken because it means that you no longer have to play QSS on Riven. I guess I should note this real quickly when it comes to Riven. Riven does have a fixed best in slot, all right? So a lot of different units, you're pretty flexible on what items you're looking to play. When it comes to Riven in particular, it's always BT, GS, plus QSS that's best in slot. Sometimes you'll see this this Giant Slayer get replaced with Titans. You can also replace it with some Ornn artifacts, but you always need to have QSS on Riven. Well, if you get Banshees, you no longer have to play QSS on Riven, and now you can play Titans here, you can play any of the Ornn artifacts here, you can play IE here, you can play Hodge here. This QSS just becomes a much more useful item, which makes your Riven a lot stronger. So Banshee's by far the strongest support item that you can get. Obsidian Cleaver, still quite strong on Viego. You can also technically run it on Caitlyn if you want to, but much better on Viego. And then these 2 here are not very good. So Virtue of the Martyr, this is sort of a stall support item. This is not a stall comp. This is a blitz comp. It kills things as quickly as possible. So Virtue of the Martyr, not very good. And for the same reason, Needlessly Big Gem, not very good either because the fights are over very quickly. So these are the support items you want to avoid. These are some support items you want to get. Every support item is good pretty much with the exception of these 2. So I just wanted to show them real quickly. When it comes to Ornn artifacts, there are not a whole lot of Ornn artifacts that are good. It's mostly just Infinity Force and Death's Defiance because these are items you can actually put onto your Riven. Technically, Gold Collector can go on there as well if you have Banshee's Veil. That can be your 3rd slot that replaces QSS. But most of the time, you would not replace something like GS with Gold Collector, especially if you have the augment here in Cert Coin, which provides provides you an execution on your different 8-bit units. So this is one of the augments that you can consider picking up. There's actually quite a few different augments here that are good. I'm kind of showing some of the main ones. So first of all, Omnivamp augments, very good. So Vampirism, Last Stand. I don't have Harm Assist. Here it is. Harm Assist 3, Harm Assist 2, Harm Assist 1. All of these are quite good. You have my sword. You'll notice here, sword item, sword item, sword item, sword item. And you can actually go DB here. So basically you need infinite amount of swords. Also Viego wants swords. So you have my sword, one of the strongest augments you can get for this comp. Support Cache, very strong if you're able to get that Banshees. Radiant Relics, very strong if you're able to get any Radiant for Riven. One thing I will note is that Radiant QSS is not very good. And the reason for why is that the main difference between Radiant QSS and normal QSS is normal QSS only lasts 14 seconds, where Radiant QSS lasts the full 30 seconds of the fight. But guess what? The whole fight is over in the first 14 seconds anyway. So most of the time, you were looking for Radiant BT, Radiant GS, Radiant IE, Radiant Hodge. These are the Radiants that are a little bit better on Riven. But the main goal here is the same as it is for most melee comps. You're just looking to get augments that make Riven stronger. That's it. That's the main goal. All right, so this is a fairly niche comp that you only play if you have the augment Too Big to Fail, where you go vertical bruisers, you play 6 bruisers, and then you play some sort of AP backline. So the main 2 carries that you can look at or consider here are Karthus and Twisted Fate. It used to be that Twisted Fate was the carry of choice. This was back in patch 14.1, and then they nerfed Twisted Fate and Disco in 14.2, so people stopped playing Twisted Fate and they decided to play mostly Karthus. And now Twisted Fate is buffed again in 14.3, still a little bit weaker than he was in 14.1. But now you really have the option here between Karthus, Twisted Fate, and Ziggs for your AP backline carries. And the main overall idea here is you're looking to get some form of shred, so either Ionic Spark or Shiv in the backline, and you're just going to have these bruisers blow up and kill everything, while your Karthus and Twisted Fate kill the backline. It's performing relatively well in the stats. In my experience, when I've played it, I've gone second place most of the time. It's not a win-out comp, but it is quite good, and it's very different. It's uncontested for the most part, although I will say Set and Zac, now because they're part of the Heartsteel line, are a little bit harder to find, and Karthus is part of the Pentakill line, which is still quite contested, and now Twisted Fate, people are starting to play him because of Disco. So it was very uncontested in 14.2, a little bit harder to find now. You can also consider playing Yorick here if you want to pair that with Karthus and Olaf. That'll give you 3 Pentakill. So if you're playing the Karthus backline variation, then Yorick can be a secondary carry. In fact, one thing I like about this version in particular is now you have a melee carry in the form of Yorick, and you have a range carry in the form of Karthus. One other thing you can do here is you can add Sona. So you can play Nami, Twisted Fate, Gragas, that's your 3 Disco, and then you can add on a Sona with mana items. And one of the things that's nice about that is this is a stall comp. You have 6 bruiser, you have tons of HP on your board, and Sona will help you get damage on your Twisted Fate, so you have a secondary carry. This is especially useful if you don't have items or don't have a lot of items for a secondary carry, but you want to find another source of damage, then Sona is something you might want to consider as well. Another niche augment comp, this is only played if you get a very specific augment, and that's Submit to the Pit, is this vertical moshers sort of build. And there's a couple of ways to go about it. I'm showing the way that I prefer to do it, which is to roll for Urgot 3, and then you want to build as much damage as possible onto that Urgot. So Red Buff, very good for anti-heal. Last Whisper, very good on Urgot because he actually applies it to all the targets that he hits. And then GS is just an insane item because the main issue Urgot has is that he gets stuck on the front line. So if you're able to get past that front line as soon as possible using something like GS, it can be quite good. In fact, I wouldn't be surprised if Urgot's best in slot was something like Red Buff and then double GS, and then you go like Even Shroud on Poppy or Set. But the main idea here is that you're just looking to carry Urgot, Yorick, and then maybe Karthus here, with Gnar, Yorick, and Karthus being your 3 Pentakill. And then as you level up here, maybe you can add Jazz or something. Most of the time, you're not going to be able to level too much. This is mostly a top 4 comp. There is one other way that you can play this comp, and that is to go for Jax 3 with Lux 3. I have not seen that, and to be honest with you, in my opinion, you're really not supposed to play that. Maybe you can commit to that if you get Submit to the Pit on 2-1 and you have multiple Jaxes early on, but I think this is the much better way to play it. So, and this is more important if you're able to find this on 3-2. One of the best openers in the game right now is Vi, Urgot, and Set. So if you have that opener and you are able to hit this augment, you should just snap take it and play some variation of this line where you go for Urgot 3. I think this is honestly a very strong line. Again, it's basically a guaranteed top 4. You're probably not going to win most games, but it's pretty much impossible to lose in stage 4 with this Urgot. And you can actually play multiple Urgots. That's one other thing I forgot to mention here. So before you get Urgot 3, you aim to get 6 Mosher, and then you can just play 2 Urgot 2s before you have like Karthus and Yorick and all this other crazy stuff. Over this Zac, for example, you could play a second Urgot, and it's quite strong. All right, next up we have Ahri Reroll, and this is still basically the same as it's been for several patches now. If you have a good spot for it in the early game, you should play it most of the time. I have gotten to the point where I truly believe the only headliner version of Ahri that's acceptable is Emo Ahri, because both variations of the comp are much better with Emo Ahri, and I just don't think that Spellweaver is very good. So in some cases, if you have a really good Ahri spot and you can only get Ahri 3 on 3-1 if you take Spellweaver Ahri, then you have to do it. But most of the time, I would really try to only play this if you know you can hit Emo Ahri early on. So the best in slot build for Ahri is always going to be blue buff, Nashers, +1. When you're playing the Superfan version of the comp, that's going to be JG. If you're playing the 4 Emo version of the comp, where you drop Lilia and you drop Kennen for Poppy plus Amumu, then you can play Gunblade here in this 3rd slot, or you can still run JG, you can run Rabadons, you just want some sort of AP item. I think in the stats, the best one is Gunblade, but really the goal here is you're just running blue buff, Nashers +1. In a lot of cases, what you're going to find is that most people end up playing Shojin instead of blue buff. It's still 3 autos, and the reason why you see that is because it's better for item economy purposes. So you want to save as many tiers as possible for Ahri or Sona or Lulu or Seraphine as a secondary carry. So if you end up making blue buff on Ahri, it's really only slightly stronger than Shojin, but you lose the possibility of having that tier on Ahri or one of these other secondary carries. So if you have Shojin in the early game, you should just slam it. The other reason too is that you really only have so many ways to kill Sword in this comp, and it's either Shojin or Gunblade on Ahri for the most part. So you really just want to try to kill Sword any way you can. So I'm showing the best in slot build here on Ahri, but if you have Shojin instead, it's completely fine. In fact, most of my games, if you look at my match history, have been Shojin, Nashers, plus the Superfan item here. Now, in terms of when you're supposed to move into this other variation of the comp, you're really only supposed to play it if you're able to hit Poppy 2. If this is Poppy 1, you shouldn't play it, all right? So that's my main condition. Most of the time, you're not going to hit Poppy 2. You're not going to have enough gold to, and you're going to just want to push levels instead. So you end up playing this version of the comp instead, and that's completely okay. When it comes to your support items here, Aegis of the Legion, Zeke's, and Chalice are the best options you have, with Chalice and Zeke's being the best. Surprisingly, Zeke's is actually a little bit better than Chalice because it's just more important that your Ahri cast than the cast actually doing all that much damage. In fact, that's part of why, again, we're going for a mana item plus attack speed item here on Ahri. So when it comes to Zeke's versus Chalice, if you have the option, then you should go for Zeke's over Chalice. And then Aegis is just good in every single comp that exists. When it comes to your Ornn artifacts, you have Mana Zane, Diamond Hands, and Gambler's Blade. Mana Zane and Gambler's Blade are very good on Ahri. Mana Zane is just a mana item that helps her get to that 4th cast as quickly as possible. Gambler's Blade is a replacement for Nashers, and you can also farm a ton of gold in the early game. And then Diamond Hands is very good on Echo or Nico, preferably Echo, but if you have to put it on Nico, it's completely fine. If you're not able to get one of these 3 items, you're really just looking for an item for one of your tanks. And then when it comes to our different augment choices here, Omnivamp is surprisingly valuable. So your Ahri can actually drain tank at the end of the fight, but you pretty much never have the ability to build Omnivamp onto your Ahri itself. Because again, if you're playing the Superfan version, you always have to have a mana generation item plus an attack speed item, and then you have your Superfan item in the 3rd slot here. That's part of why Gunblade is the best item in the version where you don't play Superfans, because Omnivamp on Ahri is so strong where she's able to actually drain tank at the end of the fight. So when it comes to your different augment selections here, just one thing I want to note is that Vampirism is quite good. Harmicist is quite good as well. Pumping Up, very good on 2-1 because again, that attack speed helps Ahri cast quicker. Iron Asset's very strong because it helps you get the best in slot Ahri items. Ahri is very item dependent. In fact, that's one of the conditions for playing Ahri is that you have good items for her on 2-1. New Recruit, very good in any Superfan composition because it helps you fit additional units that give you those traits that you need. And then I wanted to briefly talk about Parting Gifts because this is a slightly different augment that most of the time you're not going to play, but if you have Ionic Spark in the front line, this will guarantee that your Ionic Spark survives until the end of the fight. And that is very, very, very powerful. So what you aim to do with this is you put your Ionic Spark on some sort of unit, whether it be Echo or Nico. And if that unit dies, it's fine because they pass the Ionic Spark to the next unit. This is why it's important that whatever unit is holding the Ionic Spark, you probably don't want to put multiple items on that unit. So you kind of have to play around this augment to make it work, but it guarantees that your Shred stays alive for the entire duration of the fight, which is very impactful. Pandora's items guarantees that you get your best in slot for Annie as well as Ahri, which is quite difficult to do, again, because you can see here, best in slot for Annie is actually blue buff, best in slot for Ahri is blue buff. You want a lot of tiers in this comp, so if you get Pandora's on 2-1, you can guarantee that you get all those different tiers. And then Cursed Crown. I've actually taken Cursed Crown with Annie before and gone first place. You need to have Annie 3 before you take this, so don't be a madman and take Cursed Crown on 2-1. But you can take Cursed Crown on 3-2 or 4-2 if you have Annie 3 already and you have a good setup for it, because again, additional slots and Superfan compositions are quite strong. Also, on that front, I didn't include it here, but return on investment. And of course we have an error, but return on investment, which is the augment that allows you to roll to get an additional Tactician's Crown, also quite good. You can actually take that on 2-1 because you're going to roll extensively on 3-1 in order to hit your Annie 3. So those are the main notes here when it comes to your different augment selection choices. All right, next up we have Seraphine Reroll. It's been around for a while here. It's still roughly the same, where you run Shojin plus Morello on your Seraphine. Third item is the Superfan item with Rabadons. It's been a pretty standard comp for a while here, so you have your 3 Superfans with Kennen, Nico, and Lilia, and then you have your secondary carry as Ahri most of the time. There are variations where you run Lulu as your secondary carry. Really, this just comes down to how many Lulus you find while rolling for Seraphine 3. If you're not able to find at least 6 Lulus, then I would just go for Ahri instead. And to be honest with you, I actually think you can argue that Ahri 2 is better than Lulu 3 anyway, if you don't have the augments that enable Lulu. So that would be Twin Terror, Hologram, or Trickster's Glass for the Lulu herself. So most of the time I just go for Ahri 2, especially if you get KDA Headliner on your Seraphine. So if you get KDA Headliner on level 8, you're going to play Kai'Sa plus Akali, and you're going to have your 7 KDA here. If you have KDA Spat, you can actually replace this Kai'Sa with Karthus and put the KDA Spat onto Karthus instead. You can also put the KDA Spat onto Echo, which is quite strong. And you're just looking to play either 7 KDA or 5 Spellweaver if you get Spellweaver Seraphine. So if you have Spellweaver Seraphine, you're going to have Echo, Seraphine plus Ahri, and then you're going to fill in with either Sona or Lulu. And in some cases, if you don't really know what to add to your board, you can add this Naren and get 4 Superfan, which gives you some Omnivamp on Seraphine. It could be helpful if you have anything, or if you're fighting against anybody who has backline access. For example, if you're playing against Pentakill, so if you're playing against Akali Karthus, then you might want to have that Omnivamp on your Seraphine. But most of the time, you're really looking to fill in with these units over here. When it comes to your support items, it's the same as every comp. You're looking for Aegis, Zeke's, and Chalice. There are a lot of different options that are good here. Needlessly Big Gem, surprisingly actually pretty decent in this comp. So most of the time we've been trashing on Needlessly Big Gem, but it's actually decent here. Still wouldn't really take it in the late game, but if you get offered it in the early game and can farm some gold with it, it's quite good. When it comes to your artifacts, Mana Zane, Diamond Hands, and Gambler's Blade, you'll notice that these are the exact same items as the Annie comp. It's because it's pretty similar. So Gambler's Blade is just an attack speed item for your Ahri in most cases, or maybe your Sona. Mana Zane is quite good on both, let me think here, both Lulu and Seraphine, and then Diamond Hands, very good on Echo and Nico. Specifically Echo, though, I think it's a little bit better on. And then when it comes to your augments here, March of Progress, completely broken. So I want to note, for any 2-cost reroll composition, whether you're playing Kayle Reroll, if you're playing Katarina Reroll, if you're playing really anything, March of Progress is completely broken. So if you have this as an option here and you think you're going to play Seraphine Reroll, March of Progress is quite good. Three's a Crowd, quite good. Pumping Up, again, this is just true for any of the Ahri compositions. Pumping Up is usually going to be quite good. Most of these Superfan compositions also make a lot of use out of bulk as well as uplink, because you get that free item. You also have Infusion here, surprisingly good in this composition, according to the stats. Cruel Pact, even though it's not quite as good as March of Progress, is also viable. And then Remember Your Roots is completely broken, because again, you're playing vertical KDA, so you get that value on every single unit. And more importantly, attack speed is very valuable in this comp. We just mentioned that Pumping Up is very good. This is just an attack speed augment, and Remember Your Roots gives attack speed on your whole team. Quite good. All right, next up we have Ahri Warriors, or RA Melee, or whatever you want to call it. I think Ahri Warriors is the most popular name, so that's what we'll go with. The fundamental idea behind this is you have these 5 core units: Lilia, Echo, Nico, Ahri, and Kennen. So you have your 3 Superfans plus Echo and Ahri. And then you have a bunch of different packages that you can add that are all melee carries. And the 3 main unique ones are Poppy, Viego, and Zed. The standard one, which I guess I'll show real quickly, is Akali. So if you get Akali, and you get KDA Akali specifically, you're able to play this level 8 board where you have 7 KDA. This is the standard, easiest one to understand. This is the one that you'll see on a lot of different stats websites. It's the most common build. Okay, so this is ideally what you're going for. But if you don't hit this, there are a lot of different options that you have available. And what I've shown here at the bottom is all of those different options plus the different units you can consider adding with them. So for example, let's say you have Emo Poppy. So we could change this here. You're going to add these 2 units above the Poppy. The way that I've organized this is that their first trait, so in this case for Poppy, the first trait is Emo. You look at the units above, those are the ones that you'll add. The bottom trait here, or the second trait here, this is the units that you would add. You would add the ones on the bottom here. So in this case, you would add Poppy, Gnar, and Lulu, and you'll get these traits here at the top. Looks great. If you get Mosh or Poppy instead, you can consider adding in these units. So you would add Lulu plus a Mumu. You get your 3 Spellweaver. You get your 2 Emo for your Poppy, which is very important. You have 3 Guardians instead of just 2, but who cares? It's fine. But this is one build you can consider. Then when it comes to Viego, you have a lot of different choices here. If you have Pentakill Viego, you can add Lulu plus Gnar, and that'll give you your 3 Pentakill plus 3 Spellweaver, and you even get 4 Superfans, so your Viego gets even more Omnivamp, which is great. 4 Superfan is completely fine for these melee carries because Omnivamp is always good on melee carries. If you get Edgelord Viego instead, you're going to add Viego, Kayle, and then you can consider replacing Kennen for Gnar, so that you can fit 3 Spellweaver in. Or you can just say, all right, whatever, and not play 3 Spellweaver, play 4 Superfan. You get these traits on your front line, but you lose 3 Spellweaver on Ahri. To be honest with you, I'm not exactly sure what's better. I haven't really run into this case, but it is something to consider here. So let's go ahead and put these units back in place. Then if you get EDM Zed, you would add these 3 units in. So you would have Seraphine and Evelynn. This gives you your 2 Crowd Diver and 5 KDA. So it buffs up your Ahri a little bit and kind of buffs up the rest of your team, but really 5 KDA is not a very strong trait. The main advantage of this is that this is a very cheap board. So you're going to be able to go level 9 a lot quicker than most other people and hopefully have more resources to be able to spike on 9. And then if you have Crowd Diver Zed, you can add Gragas plus Zac, still get your EDM on Zed, which really isn't that important. So you really don't need this Zac, but this is one possibility here where you get this very nice looking trait tree. To be honest with you, I've never seen anybody play this line. So you don't actually have to play Zac plus Gragas. You could actually just play whatever high quality units you want. The main thing here is you want that 3rd Spellweaver, so it can be a Lulu, it can be a Sona, it could be a Seraphine. You could even consider playing 5 KDA here and just saying forget EDM on Zac. But I wanted to show some, or on Zed rather. I just wanted to show some very nice looking trait-based boards that you can play. Now the main thing to understand about this is that these are all very flexible boards. So you're not looking necessarily to play these for the entirety of the game. These are just things that get you through stage 4 and 5, get you to level 9, and then hopefully you can spike into some of the stronger combinations that exist out there. Like for example, this Akali variation, which actually is somewhat of an endgame board, whereas some of these other boards, like for example, the Viego boards, I don't consider them stable in stage 6. So you would have to transition into something else, I think, in stage 6. You'd have to look for Yorick, for example. I guess that's one last thing I want to note here is that Kennen can get replaced for Yorick, and you would add Gnar into your board, and then you would try to get a 3rd Pentakill in, whether that be Viego or Karthus, for example. Those are some different options that you have available for spiking on 9. Now, when it comes to support items, it's very hard to look up support items for this comp because I just showed a million different variations that exist, and there's not really what I would call a main variation other than potentially this one. So I'll just show the same main support items that are good in every comp. You have Aegis, Zeeks, and Chalice. Your Ornn artifacts, you have Infinity Force, Death's Defiance, Gambler's Blade. Gambler's Blade works on Ahri. Death's Defiance works on any of the melee carries that I showed. Infinity Force also works on any of the melee carries that I showed. Mana Zane works very well on Akali, but not really on anybody else. So these are the items that are super flexible on everyone, but there are some specific Ornn artifacts that might work with specific melee carries, and that's done on a case-by-case basis. And then when it comes to augments here, again, very hard to look up augments for this comp because there's so many different variations. So I just wanted to show some very generically good ones. So you have Little Buddies. Anytime you're playing a Superfan comp with 4 or 5 cost carries, very strong augment. Pumping Up, very good anytime that you're playing Ahri. Jewel Lotus 3, very strong on 4-2. Combat Caster, very strong when you're playing Ahri. New Recruit, always strong when you're playing Superfans. Harm Assist, very strong when you're playing melee carries. Surprisingly, Infusion has quite good stats when you're playing Ahri carry, so also something worth noting. And then Return on Investment, again, same concept as New Recruit. Additional slots, always valuable when you're looking to play a Superfan composition. All right, so Kayle Reroll, they decided to nerf the headliner. It used to give 25% additional attack speed. Now it's down to 20% additional attack speed. And they also nerfed Mordekaiser 3's damage. It's still a very good composition. It's still the best 2-cost reroll that exists in the game. Best in slot on Kayle is the Rageblade you get from Superfan, plus Gunblade, plus either Rageblade or Archangel. I think Archangel is slightly better than second Rageblade, but both are completely fine. I will say that I think that Gunblade is 100% mandatory. No Gunblade on Kayle is quite noticeable, especially if you're playing Mordekaiser 3, and then you want your secondary carries to be Karthus, Viego, Akali, just basically your standard Pentakill board that you see most of the time. One other thing I want to note about building Kayle is that if you get Zhonya's Paradox, it is by far the best item for Kayle, and you're going to run either Rageblade Zhonya's plus Archangel or Rageblade Zhonya's plus Gunblade. And you can also run double Rageblade Zhonya's, but I think the two builds that I listed first are the best by far. The main idea here is that Zhonya's gives you 3 additional seconds at the end of the fight, and if your unit is scaling throughout the entire duration of the fight, those 3 seconds are worth a lot more than the 3 seconds at the start of the fight. So a lot of times this Zhonya's kill is going to be able to completely finish out fights. If you played last set and watched Azir, or if you watched TF during the TF patch, it's kind of like that. When you have scaling items with Zhonya's, it's completely broken. Now, when it comes to your support items, Aegis, Zeke's, Chalice of Power, it's the same thing as it is for every single comp. These support items are completely broken. You also have Locket that's quite good. Obsidian Cleaver is very good on Viego since he spreads the effect to multiple units. When we look at our Ornn artifacts here, we already talked about Zhonya's. Infinity Force is good on Viego. That's Defiance, also good on Viego. Diamond Hands can go on either Mordekaiser or Viego. It's not an Edge of Night substitute on Viego because it does not reset aggro, but it does give him time to heal himself back up. So it's okay if you have to put it on him, it's fine. And then when we talk about our augments here, the main thing of note is that any prismatic econ augment on 2-1 is very strong. So that's your Shopping Spree, March of Progress, and Cruel Pact. Also, any augment that guarantees that you get your best in slot items. So Component Buffet, Magic Wand, Crown Guarded for Mordekaiser, Pandora's items, all of these things are quite good. And then you also have some combat augments here. So you have Metalheads, very good specifically with Pentakill. Heavy Hitters, very good with any reroll composition. Remember Your Roots, very strong with Pentakill because you're going vertical in the trait. And then Gifts from the Fallen, very good because almost always your Kayle is going to be the last one alive. So she gets access to all of these traits or all of these stats, and she has Omnivamp, so most of the time she'll win at the end of the fight. All right, so we are now at the start of the B tier or conditional compositions. We're going to go into a little bit less detail for these, starting off with Yasuo. So Yasuo is an Edgelord reroll, which means you always have the same package you have for all Edgelord reroll, which is Mordekaiser, Viego, and Kayle. Gives you 3 Pentakill, 2 out of 3 Edgelord. Then you 3-star your Yasuo here, and you add a bunch of true damage units in. So you have Echo, you have Akali as a secondary carry, you have Kennen, you have Senna, you have Kiana, and then you can also fill in with some Edgelords in the late game as well. One thing I will note is that they buff Senna, so if you're able to play Yasuo 3 with Senna 3 can be quite good, but most of the time you're just going to end up with a Kayle duo carry. The condition for playing this comp is really just you need to have items on Yasuo as soon as possible, so you need to have some sort of headliner Yasuo in stage 1. On 2-1, you need to ideally get one of these augments. So these are a bunch of different item augments that you can put onto Yasuo on 2-1. You have Freaky Friday, Component Buffet, Idealism, Not Today, and Pandora's items. The main goal here is you need to have 2 items on Yasuo or even 3 items on Yasuo by stage 3. If you don't have a fully itemized Yasuo by stage 3, it feels awful, especially if you don't have Yasuo 3 by stage 3. So the conditions for playing this is why nobody plays it in high-low for the most part, is you need to have several Yasuos by 2-1, you need to have perfect items for him, ideally by 3-1, and you need to have Yasuo 3 by stage 3. And if you have those 3 conditions, then this is a very, very good comp. But outside of that, most of the time, it's not very good. So it's something to be mindful of if you get a bunch of Yasuos in the early game and if you have good items. Otherwise, not really a comp you should be looking to play most of the time. All right, so Senna Reroll. They decided to buff Senna at all stars, actually, but especially at 3 stars. She does a lot more damage now. This is her best in slot build where she gets Shojin from Superfan, and then you want to fill it out with an attack speed item. Nashor's is usually the best one, but you can also go red buff if you're missing anti-heal, and then some sort of AP item with Rabadon's being the very best one, but you can also go JG, you can also go Archangel here, but by far Rabadon's is the best one, especially because so much of her damage is front-loaded anyway. And then you want to play the Superfan core, and then you want to to add as many true damage units as possible until you get to 6 true damage. And there's a couple of other ways that you can fill out the comp. You can add a rapid fire unit with either Caitlyn or Lucian. You can add a KDA unit with Ahri. And then your secondary carry is usually going to be a Kayle. And then if you have a true damage spat, it can go on either Caitlyn if you have true damage Senna, or if you have rapid fire Senna, you can consider putting that true damage spat onto Ahri and then getting a 3rd Spellweaver in and playing 6 true damage with 3 Spellweaver with Ahri as your secondary carry along with a Kayle. All right, let's talk about Twisted Fate. So Twisted Fate is back in the meta somewhat because they decided to revert one of the nerfs that they did to him in 14.2. They made it so that his mana went back to being 105. And as a result of that, he's actually decent again. He's not S tier like he was before. And he's certainly not taking over where he's very, very weak to like Ezreal, for example, because of the positioning. So if you position like the standard TF positioning where you have this huge diagonal line where Ezreal will just one-shot your whole board, yeah, that's not going to work out so well for you. If you're playing against a non-Ezreal heavy lobby, then Twisted Fate actually will perform reasonably well because he actually does decently into some of the other comps that exist in the meta, but really not going to do very well into Ezreal. Also not going to do very well into Riven. So I just want to mention that there are some hard counter matchups that you're going to struggle with if you decide to go this line. This is mostly if you have a good Disco Dazzler opener in the early game and want to commit to the line because you have good items for it and you have a pretty easy transition into it from early into late game. So your standard 7 units here are the 5 disco units where you have Nami, Twisted Fate, Taric, Blitzcrank, and Gragas. And then you're going to add Echo, and then usually a Spellweaver of either Lulu or Sona. And then you can add a Bruiser unit here with Zac or Alawi. And then you can add some Dazzlers here with Lux, Ziggs, and then I don't have it here, but also Bard is an acceptable option. Usually Zac gets paired with Lux. You can also add Thresh in as well if you have Taric on your board. These are some of the different flexible ways in which you can play the comp. And then the ideal level 9 board is going to have all of the 5 cost. So you have Alawi in there, you have Sona in there, and then you have Ziggs. And you play something like this, especially useful if you have Dazzler TF, because then you'll have 4 Dazzler with Nami, Ziggs, and Twisted Fate. You'll still have your 5 discos, so you have 2 disco balls. Just remember that for the positioning here, if you're playing against the Heartsteel Ezreal board, you cannot do this position, which is the standard. Most of the time, this is what you were going for. You're going to have to split up a little bit more, maybe do the split positioning that we saw happening during the TF patch, where you have 1 disco ball over here, and you have your main tank, and then maybe a Alawi over here, put your Twisted Fate over here, put your Sona over here, then you have your second tank with Echo over on this side, put your Ziggs over here, and kind of split things up this way, so that it's less likely that you have Ezreal hitting your whole board. It's still difficult to avoid Ezreal, though, in general, so highly recommend that you be cautious of that if you're playing the comp, and just accept if you're only going to be able to top 4 with it. This is not going to be a win out comp most of the time. Ahri Sentinels is part of the meta still, but it's a little bit more conditional than it was before, like in patch 13.24b, where you could force it every single game. Now it's a little bit more dependent on hitting Sentinel +1 from, say, a Wandering Training Dummy, or if you have perfect items on Ahri, maybe some good augments for the comp. Other than that, though, most of the time you're not looking to play this. I have seen it win in lobbies, though, where you have that Wandering Training Dummy with Sentinel +1, so this should be something that you're mindful of. There's also another variation that we'll talk about in a moment here that's also quite good with Sentinels. Kayle Sentinels is basically a variation of Ahri Sentinels, where instead of playing Ahri, you're playing Kayle. The fundamental idea is the same, where you have these units that are stalling in the front line, and then you have an AP Gunblade carry in the back line that scales. So in this case, you're playing Kayle 3 with Rageblade, Archangel, plus Gunblade, and she's just going to heal up your front line. Ideally, you hit Pentakill or Sentinel Mordekaiser, and you're able to 3-star him, and he will be your secondary carry along with Kayle. And this, according to the stats, is actually quite good. It's actually one of the strongest comps in the game, but it's very hard to hit. Most of the time, you're not going to be able to hit this Mordekaiser 3. It's pretty conditional, but it's something that I haven't seen a lot of people talk about or play, and according to the stats, it's quite good. So something to be mindful of if you see it, or if you see an opportunity to play it. For example, if you get a dummy that's Pentakill plus Sentinel, or maybe Sentinel plus Edgelord, that could be quite good with this comp. All right, next up we have Katarina Reroll, and this is mainly if you have a bunch of Katarinas early on and you have some gloves, tears, and rods that you can build this best in slot Katarina build with double Hodge plus JG. One of these Hodges comes from Superfan. Really strong if you have Idealism, for example, get that additional damage on Katarina, because you basically play this comp as if you only have 1 unit on your entire board. That's effectively how this comp gets played. She can drain tank, she does a ton of damage. Really at its strongest if you're able to find Crowd Diver Katarina and are able to play 6 Crowd Diver in the late game when you find Kiana. If you're not able to play Crowd Diver Katarina, if you only find Country and can't get to this 6th Crowd Diver, it's a little bit weaker. It's not going to cap out as strong. You're probably only going to get a 3rd or a 4th, depending on how early you find Katarina. But this Katarina 3 unit with best in slot items, especially if you can duo carry Zed, which I will say, finding Zed when you're playing a 2-cost reroll comp is quite hard. But if you can get to this spot, even Zed1, you're usually almost always guaranteed a top 4, because until people start getting really highly capped boards, this Katarina just one-shots everything. It's unbelievably strong. It's something really, again, to be mindful of if you have a lot of Katarinas in the early game and you have some decent items, or if you find a Katarina and get the Idealism augment, also very strong and worth considering. Next up, we have Country Reroll. This has been around forever. It's the same exact variation that you've seen the whole time, where you play 5 3-cost units with Set, Amumu, Urgot, Vex, and Samira, and then you fill out the comp with Country units like Tahm Kench and Thresh. Ideally, you're able to find Country Samira so that you can fit this board perfectly on level 7 with 5 Country. The one thing I will note is that this used to be a very strong composition and is no longer very strong without Country +1, hence why it's moved down to B tier. So if you are able to find that Country +1, you're going to want to push to level 8, add Katarina to your board, and then you're going to put that Country emblem on Set, ideally, and still fully itemize your Mumu and Vex, and you'll have 7 Country here. It's still not that strong. The main thing that determines whether or not you're going to be able to top 2 or not is how many of your 3-cost you're able to 3-star. So if you're able to get 3-star Mumu, 3-star Urgot, 3-star Samira, and 3-star Vex, then of course it's very strong, but most of the time you're going to have a really tough time getting to that point, and you're not as stable as you were before because they actually nerfed 5 Country back in 14.2. So in my opinion, this is no longer as good as it used to be, and it's pretty much only played if you have March of Progress or Cruel Pact on 2-1, or if you get an early Country spat and know that you're going to be able to play 7 Country, and even then, 7 Country is not that strong unless you can hit all of your 3-stars, which good luck pushing to level 8 and also being able to hit 3-cost 3-stars. So the main issue with this is that it costs too much gold and you need a spat for it to be really strong. If those conditions are met, then it is a pretty good comp. Next up, we have Olaf Reroll, which was gathering some steam in last patch. A lot of people were starting to play it. It was a lot of fun. And they decided to nerf the 3-star version and not the 2-star version, when the 2-star version in stage 2 was the problem, and the 3-star version was not really that big of an issue in the late game. So I don't really understand their reasoning behind doing this, but effectively at this point, the only time you should play Olaf is if you get one of these 2 augments on 2-1. That is either Gargantuan Resolve or Too Big to Fail, and you need to have a decent number of Olafs already before picking the augment. If you have those conditions met, then you could play Olaf. Other than that, I would avoid playing him. The overall idea here is that you're trying to get to 6 Bruiser and then play some sort of Pentakill backline with Karthus or Kayle carry. I think Kayle is better if you're able to get 3-star Kayle, but Karthus is okay as well if that's what you have to settle for. And of course, Yorick is very good in the late game if you're able to get to that. But the main goal here is understand that you cannot play Olaf 3, in my opinion, without one of these 2 augments. If you hit an early Olaf 3 and you don't have one of these 2 augments, then you should just use him to try to go fast 9, and then you sell him and transition into some sort of other carry, because he just simply won't do enough if you do not have those augments to empower him. All right, so Superfan Jazz. It is the exact same board since the start of the set. It has not changed at all. It's still the same concept where you're only looking to play it if you have a really good opener for it, or maybe if you hit That's Jazz Baby on 2-1 or 3-2, or if you have really good items, you can consider playing this. It is very strong if you're able to hit 3-star Bard, 3-star Misfortune, and then either 3-star Nico or 3-star Echo. But if you don't have that condition met where you have all 3 of these 3-starred, usually the comp is not very good. It falls off pretty hard. It's pretty hard to hit Misfortune 3 because all the Ezreal players are playing Misfortune on their board, just naturally. I mean, luckily, most of them are only playing 1 Misfortune, but if they upgrade that Misfortune and like 2 people do it, that's 6 Misfortunes out of the pool, which can be quite problematic for you. Also, a lot of people hold on Bard in the early game just because they know they're going to have to play Bard in the late game for Jazz. So there's a lot of things that kind of make this, in my opinion, not as strong as you might think it would be otherwise. However, if you have a prismatic econ augment on 2-1 like Cruel Pact or March of Progress, maybe even Shopping Spree, then you can consider going for this line because you'll actually have enough gold to hit all of these different units. So these are your main best in slot items. Rageblade, you need to have an attack speed item on Misfortune. You need to have some form of Sunder, either from Last Whisper or Even Shroud. And then the Superfan item is Deathblade. Same thing with Bard here. Some sort of mana generation item, some sort of AP item, and then the Adaptive Helm is his Superfan item. And then you can itemize Kai'Sa as well if you're able to get Kai'Sa 3. And then also one thing of note is that they buffed Bigger Shot. So if you get Kai'Sa 3 plus Misfortune 3 and you have Bigger Shot, which is the augment, that can be quite strong as well. Brings us back to the first patch of the set, actually. But other than that, a pretty conditional comp. You need to hit a lot in order for it to be strong. So as a result of that, most of the time, I try not to play it. Jax Reroll. It is probably one of the most popular comps that people like to talk about a lot. People really like to play Lux Reroll because it's really fun to play. So here's the conditions for playing it. You have to go for Jax 3, and you have to have Zhonya's. If you don't have Zhonya's on Jax 3, then the comp is not viable. The major issue with this, I actually watched, or I had a podcast from, I think it's Don't Talk If You Don't Know, where Alan was talking about why Lux is such an issue. And it has to do with the fact that if you don't slam any mana generation items in the early game, because you really don't want mana generation on Lux for the most part, you just want full AP, you're going to lose a ton of HP. But mana generation is not that good on Lux. You want full AP on her because of the EDM effect where you just get these cast anyway. So you don't actually need mana generation because the EDM effect just gives you the full cast. So the problem is you're slamming items that are suboptimal in the early game, or you slam items that are optimal in the early game, you save HP, but then in the late game, you have these mana generation items on Lux and she doesn't do enough damage to one-shot the backline. So this is one of the major issues. Again, this is part of why you go for Jax, because you can actually build decent items in the early game. Hodge plus JG are fine if you're able to get them onto a decent melee carry, or if you're able to get them onto a Kayle headliner, for example. And if you have Zhonya's, then you know that you're actually going to be able to possibly win out. If you don't have Zhonya's, this comp is just not strong enough. Do not try to play it, especially if you're trying to climb, all right? And you need to have, ideally, if you really want to win out, you need to have both Jax and Lux. So it's pretty hard to win out with this comp, but if you do get a Zhonya's on 2-1, you can consider playing it. It's also really hard to find Zed in this current meta because of all the people that are playing Heartsteel. And the other thing I want to note here is that I think the best way to fill out this comp is not for Mosher. You just add Jazz to your board instead. And then when you level up to 9 eventually, you're going to add Lucian as well to your board. And that's the main way in which you play Jax or EDM. The last comp I want to talk about is Garen, and I'm not even going to show the team builder for this because really all you need to see is this guy's match history, who has 100% dedicated himself to the art of Garen, and it's not looking good. All right, this guy is, or was, a high Grandmaster player, very close to Challenger, and since the patch hit, he has done nothing but try to make Garen work. And while there have been a couple of top 4s, the most common result has not been top 4s, and you can see that he played 13 games on the first day of the patch, averaged a 6.23, lost 320 LP. The next day, he played 8 more games with Garen, averaged a 6.13, and then he played 5 more games of Garen today and averaged a 5. He has went from nearly Challenger at 800 LP to 0. Zilch, nada, right? So whenever somebody tells you that Garen is good, it is not good. Do not play it. Do not try to make it work. The buff that they did was not good enough unless you're trying to have fun. And if you're just trying to have fun, then have a great time. You could play Garen, but otherwise you probably shouldn't.